Marcus Rodriguez had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Living in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Millbrook for the past 15 years, he knew every face, every routine, and every car that belonged on Elm Street. At 62, the retired postal worker had developed what his wife Elena called an unhealthy obsession with keeping their community safe. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. Children waited for school buses, joggers made their morning rounds, and the familiar rhythm of suburban life played out before him like a well-rehearsed symphony. That's when he saw him. A young man, probably in his early 20s, walking slowly down the sidewalk. Nothing unusual about that, except Marcus had never seen this particular individual before. The stranger wore a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, despite the warm October weather, and his hands were shoved deep in his pockets. But what caught Marcus's attention most was the way the young man kept looking at the houses, his gaze lingering on windows and driveways with what Marcus interpreted as suspicious intent. The stranger stopped directly in front of the Henderson house 3 doors down. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who lived alone, had left for her weekly grocery shopping trip just 30 minutes earlier. Marcus knew her schedule by heart. The young man stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 20 seconds, before continuing his walk. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. In his 15 years of unofficial neighborhood monitoring, he had developed a sixth sense about potential trouble. This felt wrong. Everything about the hooded figure screamed danger to his well-trained eye. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. Emergency services, what's your emergency? This is Marcus Rodriguez at 1247 Elm Street. I need to report suspicious activity. There's a young man in a hoodie casing houses in our neighborhood. He's clearly planning something. The dispatcher's voice remained calm and professional. Can you describe the individual, sir? Marcus pressed his face closer to the window, trying to get a better look. Male, early 20s, wearing a dark gray hoodie. He's been stopping in front of houses, clearly looking for targets. He just spent time staring at Mrs. Henderson's house and she's not home. Is the individual currently on public property? Yes, he's on the sidewalk, but he's obviously planning a break-in. I've lived here 15 years, and I know when something's not right. The dispatcher assured him that units would be dispatched to investigate. Marcus hung up feeling satisfied that he had done his civic duty. He had protected his neighborhood from what was clearly a dangerous criminal. 20 minutes later, 2 police cruisers turned onto Elm Street, their lights flashing but sirens silent. Marcus watched from his window as the officers stepped out of their vehicles. Officers Janet Murphy and Robert Chen had both worked this beat for several years and knew Marcus by reputation. His calls usually turned out to be false alarms, but they were required to investigate every report. The young man in the hoodie was now 4 blocks away, completely unaware of the developing situation. Officer Murphy spotted him first, walking casually along Maple Avenue with no apparent urgency or suspicious behavior. "Excuse me," Officer Murphy called out as she approached. "Can we have a word with you?" The young man turned, pulling back his hood to reveal a friendly face and warm brown eyes. He was clearly surprised but not alarmed. "Of course, officer. Is everything okay? We received a report about someone acting suspiciously in the neighborhood. Mind telling us what you're doing in the area?" The young man smiled, a gesture that transformed his entire appearance. What Marcus had interpreted as menacing now looked simply youthful and approachable. "I'm actually looking at houses. My wife and I are thinking about moving to this neighborhood. We heard it's really safe and family-friendly." Officer Chen stepped forward, noting the young man's relaxed demeanor and cooperative attitude. "Are you working with a real estate agent? We wanted to get a feel for the area first, you know? See what the neighborhood vibe is like before we start the formal process. My wife's pregnant with our first child, and we want to make sure we pick the right place to raise a family." The officers exchanged glances. This was clearly not the dangerous criminal Marcus had described. Still, they had to complete their investigation. "Do you have any identification?" Officer Murphy asked. The young man reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license. "Here you go, David Park. I live about 10 miles from here, but like I said, we're hoping to move closer to this area." Officer Chen examined the license. Everything appeared to be in order. David Park, age 23, clean record, no outstanding warrants. The address matched his story about living in a nearby community. Mr. Park, can you tell us why you had your hood up while you were walking? David looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned on his face. Oh, that. I was on the phone with my wife earlier talking about the houses we'd seen. I always put my hood up when I'm on the phone outside. It cuts down on wind noise, habit from when I was deployed overseas. Deployed? Officer Murphy's interest sharpened. Yes, ma'am. Navy SEAL just finished my second tour 6 months ago. Still getting used to civilian life, to be honest. The officer's entire demeanor shifted. They were now talking to a military veteran, someone who had served his country with distinction. The suspicious activity report suddenly seemed even more misguided than usual. Thank you for your service, Officer Chen said sincerely. And congratulations on the baby. David's face lit up with pride. Thank you. It's going to be our first, so we're pretty excited. That's why we're being so careful about choosing the right neighborhood. Meanwhile, Marcus had positioned himself strategically by his front door, waiting for the officers to return with news of the arrest. He had already begun composing the story he would tell Elena when she returned from her morning errands. Another dangerous criminal caught, thanks to his vigilance. Officer Murphy's radio crackled to life as they prepared to leave David to continue his house hunting. The dispatcher was asking for an update on the suspicious person report. This is Unit 247, she responded. No criminal activity detected. Citizen was legally engaged in legitimate activity. Calling party was mistaken. Marcus, straining to hear from his position by the door, caught fragments of the radio communication. How could he be mistaken? He had seen what he had seen. The officers returned to their vehicles and drove back toward Elm Street. They needed to follow up with the reporting party, as was standard procedure. Marcus saw them approaching and stepped outside, ready to hear about the arrest. Mr. Rodriguez, Officer Murphy said as she approached his front yard. We investigated your report. I hope you caught him before he could break into any houses. Officer Chen shook his head. Sir, there was no criminal activity. The individual you reported is a Navy SEAL veteran who was looking at houses in the neighborhood. He and his wife are expecting their first child and considering moving to this area. Marcus felt his confidence waver, but he was clearly casing the houses. The way he was looking around the hoodie, he was evaluating the neighborhood as a potential place to live, Officer Murphy explained patiently. His hood was up because he had been talking on the phone with his wife about the houses they'd seen. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Marcus had just called the police on a military hero who was simply trying to find a safe place to raise his family. The irony was not lost on him that in his attempt to protect the neighborhood's safety, he had targeted someone who had literally risked his life to protect the country's safety. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood secure, Marcus stammered. We understand your concern for community safety, Officer Chen said diplomatically. But in the future, it might be helpful to consider that people walking in public areas aren't necessarily engaged in criminal activity, even if they're unfamiliar to you. After the officers left, Marcus stood in his front yard feeling a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. How had he gotten it so wrong? He prided himself on his ability to read situations and people, yet here he had completely misinterpreted an innocent situation and caused unnecessary trouble for someone who deserved respect, not suspicion. Elena returned from her errands an hour later to find Marcus sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring out the same window where his morning had begun so differently. Everything all right, honey? She asked, setting down her shopping bags. Marcus told her about the morning's events, leaving out no details. Elena listened without judgment, though he could see her processing the implications of what had happened. Maybe, she said gently. This is a good reminder that things aren't always what they seem from a distance. That afternoon, David Park returned to Elm Street with his wife Sarah, a petite woman with an obvious baby bump and an infectious smile. They walked slowly down the sidewalk, this time without any hoods or phones, openly admiring the houses and discussing their future. Marcus watched them from his window again, but this time his perspective had completely changed. Instead of seeing potential threats, he saw what they actually were: a young couple planning their future. A veteran transitioning to civilian life, expectant parents seeking the perfect place to raise their child. The irony struck him forcefully. In his eagerness to protect his neighborhood from outsiders, he had nearly prevented exactly the kind of people who would make the community stronger and safer. David Park represented everything Marcus claimed to value: service, dedication to family, and a commitment to building a better future. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision that would surprise even Elena. He walked outside, approached the young couple as they stood discussing the merits of a house with a large backyard, and introduced himself. "Excuse me," he said, his heart racing with nervousness. "Are you the couple who was looking at houses earlier?" David and Sarah turned, both smiling politely but with a hint of caution in their eyes. "I'm David, and this is my wife, Sarah." Marcus took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. I'm the one who called the police this morning. I was wrong about what I thought I saw." The couple exchanged glances, processing this unexpected confession. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, Marcus continued, "and I guess I got too protective. When I saw you looking at houses, I misread the situation completely. I'm sorry for causing you trouble." David's response surprised Marcus completely. Instead of anger or resentment, the young veteran smiled warmly and extended his hand. "No harm done, sir. Actually, it's kind of nice to know that neighbors look out for each other around here. That's exactly what we're hoping to find in a new community." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "We want our baby to grow up somewhere where people care about each other's safety." Marcus shook David's hand, feeling both relief and a growing respect for the young man's character. Here was someone who could have easily been angry or resentful, but instead chose to see the positive intention behind a negative action. "If you don't mind me asking," Marcus said, "what made you choose this neighborhood?" David's eyes lit up. "A buddy of mine from the service grew up around here. He said it was the kind of place where neighbors become family, where kids can ride bikes safely, and where people look out for each other." Sounds like he was right. As the conversation continued, Marcus learned more about David and Sarah's story. They had met during David's brief leave between deployments, had maintained their relationship through video calls and letters, and had married just before his final tour ended. The pregnancy was a wonderful surprise that had accelerated their timeline for finding a permanent home. David had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as part of a SEAL team focused on training local forces and conducting precision operations against high-value targets. He had earned multiple commendations for valor and had never lost a team member under his command. Now he was transitioning to civilian life, using his GI Bill benefits to study engineering while working part-time as a security consultant. Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse at the local children's hospital, a job she loved but one that required long hours and emotional resilience. They were both committed to building a stable, secure life for their growing family. As the sun began to set, Marcus found himself genuinely hoping that David and Sarah would choose to move to Elm Street. What had started as a morning of suspicion and misunderstanding had evolved into an afternoon of connection and mutual respect. "Well," Marcus said as they prepared to part ways, "I hope you'll seriously consider this neighborhood. And if you do move here, you'll always have friends at 1247. David and Sarah thanked him for his honesty and kindness. As they walked back to their car, Marcus realized that his understanding of neighborhood safety had fundamentally changed. True security didn't come from keeping strangers out. It came from building relationships with good people and creating a community where everyone looked out for each other. The evening news would later report on rising crime rates in other parts of the city, but Marcus barely paid attention. He was too busy thinking about the lesson he had learned and wondering if David and Sarah would indeed become his new neighbors. Little did he know that the real surprises were yet to come. 3 weeks after their first encounter, David and Sarah Park signed a lease on the house with the large backyard, just 4 doors down from Marcus Rodriguez. The moving truck arrived on a crisp Saturday morning in November, and Marcus found himself genuinely excited to welcome his new neighbors officially. Elena had baked her famous chocolate chip cookies the night before, and Marcus carried them over as David directed the movers. The young couple's belongings told a story of their life together. Military-issued storage containers mixed with Sarah's nursing textbooks, baby furniture still in boxes, and photographs of David in his Navy uniform, alongside pictures of their wedding. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Marcus said, offering the plate of cookies to Sarah, who was taking a break from unpacking. "These smell amazing," she said, immediately taking a bite. "Oh my goodness, Elena is going to be dangerous to live near." As the day progressed, other neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. The Hendersons from next door brought lemonade. The young family across the street offered to help with the heavy lifting. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman from the corner house, arrived with a casserole and sage advice about the best local pediatricians. Marcus noticed how naturally David interacted with everyone. The veteran had an easy confidence that put people at ease, but there was also something else. A quiet awareness of his surroundings that spoke to his military training. He positioned himself to see all entrances when talking to people, and his eyes regularly scanned the area, not out of paranoia, but from ingrained habit. "You can take the soldier out of the service," David had joked when Sarah teased him about it, "but you can't take the service out of the soldier." Over the following weeks, David and Sarah quickly became integral parts of the neighborhood fabric. David proved handy with repairs, helping elderly neighbors fix leaky faucets and stuck garage doors. Sarah, despite her pregnancy, volunteered to organize a neighborhood book club for the stay-at-home mothers. Marcus found himself spending more and more time talking with David, learning about the younger man's experiences overseas and his transition to civilian life. The veteran was surprisingly open about the challenges he faced, from adjusting to the slower pace of everyday life to managing the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat zones. "Sometimes I wake up at 0400 and can't get back to sleep," David confided one evening as they worked together to help Mrs. Henderson install a new security light. "My body thinks it's time for morning patrol." Marcus, who had always thought he understood the sacrifices military families made, began to realize how little he actually knew about the ongoing challenges veterans faced long after their service ended. It was during one of these conversations that David mentioned his tattoos for the first time. They were hidden under long sleeves most of the time, but Marcus had caught glimpses of dark ink on David's forearms when he was working in the yard. "Military tats?" Marcus asked casually. David's expression grew more serious. "Some of them, yeah. My team, our deployments, fallen brothers. But there's one that's different." He didn't elaborate, and Marcus didn't press. He had learned that David would share what he wanted to share when he was ready. The neighborhood's perception of their new residents was overwhelmingly positive. David was seen as helpful and respectful, while Sarah brought energy and warmth to every interaction. The young couple represented everything people hoped for in neighbors: engaged, caring, and invested in the community's well-being. This positive impression would make what happened next all the more shocking. It was a Tuesday afternoon in December when Marcus witnessed the incident that would change everything. He was in his front yard raking the last of the fallen leaves when a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up in front of David's house. 3 men in dark suits emerged, their bearing and presentation immediately recognizable to anyone who had watched enough movies or television shows. Government agents. Marcus felt his blood run cold as the men approached David's front door. His mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. Had David been involved in something illegal during his service? Was he suspected of wrongdoing? Had Marcus's initial instincts about the young man been correct after all? The door opened, and David appeared, clearly surprised to see his visitors. Marcus was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could see David's posture change from relaxed to alert in an instant. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before the 3 men returned to their car and drove away, leaving David standing in his doorway with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. That evening, Marcus found himself consumed with curiosity and growing concern. He had genuinely grown to like and respect David, but the visit from government agents raised serious questions. During ER2P's intense areas of expectation, Elena noticed his distraction during dinner. "You're worried about David," she observed. Marcus told her about the afternoon's events. Elena listened thoughtfully before offering her perspective. "Maybe there's an innocent explanation. Couldn't it be related to his military service? Security clearances or pension paperwork?" Marcus wanted to believe that, but something felt off. The agent's demeanor had been too serious, too official for routine paperwork. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would later embarrass him deeply. Instead of simply asking David about the visit, he called his friend Jerry Williamson, a retired detective who still had contacts in law enforcement. "Jerry, I need you to do me a favor." Can you run a background check on someone? Marcus, we've been through this before. I can't just run checks on people because you're curious about your neighbors. This is different. Government agents visited him yesterday. I'm concerned about neighborhood safety. Jerry sighed. Give me the details. Marcus provided David's full name, address, and what he knew about the man's military service. Jerry promised to make some discreet inquiries and get back to him. The call came 2 days later, and Jerry's tone was unusually serious. Marcus, you need to sit down for this. Marcus felt his stomach drop. His fears were about to be confirmed. I made some calls, reached out to contacts in different agencies. The name David Park came up in multiple databases, but here's the thing. Most of the information is classified above my clearance level. What does that mean? It means your neighbor wasn't just any Navy SEAL. The level of classification around his service record suggests he was involved in some very high-level operations, the kind of stuff that doesn't get talked about publicly. Marcus felt vindicated and terrified at the same time. His instincts had been correct after all. David Park was hiding something significant. There's more, Jerry continued. I couldn't get specifics, but there are indications that he might be under some kind of ongoing investigation or surveillance. The visit from those agents? That was probably not routine. After hanging up, Marcus spent the rest of the day wrestling with what to do with this information. Should he warn the other neighbors? Should he confront David directly? Should he call the police again? That evening, he was still debating his options when Sarah knocked on his front door. She looked tired and stressed, a marked change from her usual cheerful demeanor. "Hi, Mr. Rodriguez. I was wondering if I could ask you a favor." "Of course, Sarah. What do you need?" David had to go out of town unexpectedly for a few days, work-related. "I know this sounds silly, but would it be possible for you to keep an eye on the house? I get nervous staying alone, especially being pregnant." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of deception or fear. All he saw was a tired young woman who seemed genuinely concerned about her husband's absence. "Absolutely." "Is everything all right?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "I think so. David doesn't really talk about his work much. He says it's better if I don't know the details. But sometimes men come to the house, official-looking people, and after they leave, he gets this worried expression that he tries to hide from me." Marcus felt his suspicions crystallizing. David was clearly involved in something that required ongoing contact with government agencies, something serious enough to worry a man trained for the most dangerous military operations. "How long have these visits been going on?" "Since before we moved here." "Maybe 6 months?" "David says it's normal paperwork stuff related to his security clearance, but..." She trailed off, rubbing her belly protectively. That night, Marcus found himself watching David's house from his kitchen window, just as he had done months earlier when he first spotted the young man walking through the neighborhood. But this time, his vigil felt justified. There were real secrets here, real reasons for concern. Around midnight, he saw movement. A dark figure emerged from the shadows behind David's house and moved quickly across the backyard toward the fence line. Marcus grabbed his phone and was about to call 911 when the figure stepped into a patch of moonlight, revealing David's familiar silhouette. But this David looked different. Gone was the casual confidence and easy smile. This was someone moving with military precision, someone who clearly didn't want to be seen. David scaled the back fence with fluid efficiency and disappeared into the night. Marcus stood at his window, mind racing. What kind of work trip required sneaking out of one's own house in the middle of the night? What was David Park really involved in? The next morning brought another shock. Marcus woke to find 2 more government vehicles parked on the street, and this time, the agents weren't just visiting. They were conducting what looked like a comprehensive search of David's property. Sarah was nowhere to be seen. "Mrs. Master?" Henderson called Marcus around noon, her voice shaky with concern. "Marcus, have you seen what's happening at the Park house? Those government people have been there all morning. I'm scared. What if David is some kind of terrorist or criminal?" Marcus shared her fears but tried to sound calm. "I'm sure there's an explanation, Mrs. Anderson. Let's just wait and see what develops." But privately, he was beginning to wonder if his original suspicions about David had been correct after all. Maybe the hooded figure he had seen that first day really had been dangerous. Maybe his instincts had been right, and his guilt over the incident had clouded his judgment about David's true character. The search of David's house continued for 2 days. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering speculations and sharing concerns. The image of David as the helpful, respectful veteran was rapidly being replaced by questions about his true identity and activities. On the 3rd day, the government agents packed up their equipment and left as abruptly as they had arrived. The house stood empty and somehow ominous, its windows dark and its yard showing signs of the intensive search. Sarah returned that evening, but she looked like a different person. The cheerful, energetic woman who had charmed the neighborhood had been replaced by someone who appeared exhausted and frightened. She avoided eye contact with neighbors and hurried inside as quickly as possible. Marcus watched from his window as she struggled with grocery bags, clearly pregnant and overwhelmed. His basic human decency won out over his suspicions, and he crossed the street to help. "Sarah, let me help you with those." She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I don't know what I would do without neighbors like you." As he helped carry the bags inside, Marcus noticed that the house looked different. Furniture had been moved, drawers were slightly open, and there was a general sense of disruption that spoke to the thoroughness of the government search. "Sarah," he said gently, "is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to help?" For a moment, it looked like she might break down and tell him everything, but instead she composed herself and managed a weak smile. "David should be back soon. Everything will be fine then." But Marcus could see in her eyes that she wasn't entirely sure of that herself. That night, as he lay in bed next to Elena, Marcus found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. He had been right to be suspicious, but being right didn't feel as satisfying as he had expected. Instead, he felt sad for Sarah and confused about David. The young man who had been so kind and helpful, who had served his country with distinction, was clearly involved in something that had attracted serious government attention. The question was whether that involvement was voluntary, or whether David himself might be a victim of circumstances beyond his control. As Marcus drifted off to sleep, he realized that the real story was just beginning to unfold. Whatever David Park was hiding, whatever the government agents had been looking for, the quiet suburban neighborhood of Elm Street was about to learn that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people carry the most extraordinary secrets, and sometimes those secrets come with consequences that no one could have anticipated. David Park returned to Elm Street on a cold Friday evening in late December, but the man who walked up to his front door was noticeably different from the one who had left a week earlier. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as David stood on his own porch for several minutes before using his key, as if gathering courage to enter his own home. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Henderson had started a phone tree of concerned residents. The young family across the street had begun talking about moving. Even the mailman had asked Marcus if he knew what was going on with that house. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the neighborhood's unofficial expert on the David Park situation, simply because he had been the first to call the police and had spent the most time talking with the young veteran. Neighbors sought him out for information he didn't have and reassurances he couldn't provide. Saturday morning brought an unexpected resolution to at least some of the mystery. Marcus was in his front yard half-heartedly attempting to string Christmas lights when David emerged from his house and walked directly toward him. The young man looked tired but determined, and for the first time since moving to the neighborhood, he seemed to be carrying the full weight of his military bearing. "Rodriguez," David said formally, "I owe you an explanation." Marcus set down his string of lights, sensing that this conversation would be important. "David, you don't owe me anything. We're neighbors, and neighbors respect each other's privacy. Actually, I do owe you something. You've been kind to Sarah and me from the beginning, even after that first misunderstanding. You deserve to know the truth, especially since my situation has affected the whole neighborhood." David gestured toward his front porch. "Would you mind sitting with me for a few minutes? There are some things I need to tell you." They settled into the chairs that David had positioned to overlook the street. Marcus noticed that even in this casual setting, David had chosen the chair that provided the best view of all approaches to the house. "Rodriguez, what do you know about my military service? Navy SEAL, 2 tours in Afghanistan recently separated. That's all true, but it's not the complete picture. My service record is classified because my final deployment wasn't a standard SEAL operation. I was part of a joint task force investigating military contractor fraud and corruption. Marcus felt his understanding of the situation shift. This wasn't about David being a criminal. It was about David investigating criminals. During my last tour, my team uncovered evidence of a major conspiracy involving defense contractors, military officials, and foreign nationals. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts, equipment that didn't meet specifications, and payments to enemy forces. David's voice took on the clipped precision of a military briefing. The investigation led to evidence against some very powerful people, including a few who are still in positions of authority. When I separated from active duty, I was asked to continue cooperating with the investigation as a civilian witness. The implications began to dawn on Marcus. The government agents who visited your house were investigators from multiple agencies coordinating the prosecution. The search wasn't looking for evidence against me. They were securing documents and materials that I've been safeguarding as part of the investigation. Marcus felt a wave of relief mixed with embarrassment. Once again, he had completely misread the situation, but this time his error had contributed to neighborhood anxiety and suspicion about an innocent man. David, I'm sorry. I should have just asked you directly instead of letting my imagination run wild. David held up a hand. Actually, that brings me to something else I need to tell you. Something that's going to sound unbelievable. The young veteran stood up and rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a complex tattoo that covered most of his forearm. At first glance, it appeared to be an abstract design of interwoven patterns and symbols. But as Marcus looked closer, David pointed to specific elements. This isn't just artwork, Mr. Rodriguez. It's a map. A map? The contractors we were investigating used a complex system of code names and geographic markers to hide their operations. My team spent months breaking their communication patterns. This tattoo contains the key to understanding their entire network. David traced his finger along what looked like decorative swirls. These patterns correspond to locations where fraudulent equipment was delivered. These symbols represent the code names of the main conspirators. This design here shows the financial flow of laundered money. Marcus stared at the tattoo in amazement. What he was looking at wasn't just body art. It was evidence in a massive federal investigation, permanently etched into David's skin. Why would you tattoo evidence onto your body? David's expression grew grim. Because 3 other members of my team died under suspicious circumstances after we compiled our initial report. Car accidents, training mishaps, medical emergencies. All within 6 weeks of each other. The weight of what David was telling him settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about fraud. It was about murder. The people we're investigating have resources and connections that most people can't imagine. Traditional evidence storage became impossible after my teammates started dying. So I did something that no one would expect. I made myself into the evidence. David rolled his sleeve back down. The tattoo was designed by a cryptographic specialist. To anyone who doesn't know what to look for, it's just an interesting design. But to investigators who have the key, it's a comprehensive guide to the entire conspiracy. Marcus tried to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. The quiet young man who had helped fix Mrs. Henderson's leaky faucet was carrying evidence of international conspiracy and corruption literally under his skin. The agents who've been visiting me aren't investigating me. They're protecting me. And they're using the information I'm carrying to build cases against some very dangerous people. How long will this go on? The main trials start next month. Once I testify and the evidence is officially entered into the legal system, the tattoo becomes less valuable. But until then, David gestured toward his house where Sarah was visible through the kitchen window preparing lunch. Until then, your family is in danger. We've received threats. Nothing direct, but enough to make it clear that certain people would prefer if I didn't make it to trial. Marcus felt the full impact of the situation. The neighborhood's friendly veteran wasn't just carrying evidence. He was carrying a target, and that target was living 4 doors away from Marcus's own home. David, why are you telling me this? Isn't this information supposed to be classified? David smiled for the first time in their conversation. Because you're going to hear about some of this in the news anyway once the trials start. And because I wanted you to understand that when I first moved here, I was genuinely just looking for a safe place to raise a family. The irony struck Marcus powerfully. David Park had indeed been looking for safety, but not as a perpetrator seeking to hide. He had been looking for safety as a protector seeking to survive long enough to serve justice. Also, David continued, I wanted to apologize for bringing this situation into your neighborhood. When Sarah and I chose this house, we thought my involvement in the investigation was winding down. We didn't expect the threats to escalate. Over the following weeks, as news of the massive corruption trials began to appear in national media, Marcus watched with growing admiration as David and Sarah navigated their extraordinary circumstances with remarkable grace. The young couple maintained their normal routines as much as possible. David continued helping neighbors with repairs and projects. Sarah kept attending her book club meetings, though she now traveled with a discreet security detail. They decorated their house for Christmas and invited neighbors over for holiday cookies, but Marcus now noticed things he had missed before. The way David positioned himself at neighborhood gatherings, the fact that Sarah never answered the door when David wasn't home, the unmarked cars that occasionally drove through the neighborhood at odd hours. When the trials finally began, David's testimony made national headlines. The scope of the conspiracy he helped expose was even larger than Marcus had imagined. Defense contractors had sold defective body armor to troops in combat zones, diverted medical supplies meant for military hospitals, and paid bribes to enemy forces in exchange for protection of their operations. David's tattoo, revealed in court through photographs and expert testimony, became a symbol of both ingenuity and courage. News commentators called it one of the most creative evidence preservation methods in federal law enforcement history. Several received life sentences. The conspiracy was dismantled, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent similar fraud in the future. Through it all, Marcus found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned about judgment, assumption, and the complexity of human situations. His initial suspicion of David had been both wrong and right, wrong about the nature of the danger, but right about the presence of something significant beneath the surface. The day after the final verdicts were announced, David knocked on Marcus's door with unexpected news. Sarah and I have decided to stay in the neighborhood permanently, he announced. The baby's due in 3 months, and we can't think of anywhere we'd rather raise our family. Marcus felt genuine happiness at this news. That's wonderful. The neighborhood is lucky to have you, David said with a grin. We're the lucky ones. It turns out that having a neighbor who pays close attention to what's going on in the community is exactly what a family in our situation needs. David extended his hand. Thank you for looking out for us, Rodriguez, even when you didn't know you were doing it. As Marcus shook David's hand, he realized that his understanding of Neighborhood Watch had evolved completely. True community security wasn't about keeping strangers out or viewing unfamiliar people with suspicion. It was about building relationships with good people and creating an environment where everyone looked out for each other. The following spring, David and Sarah's daughter was born. The neighborhood rallied around the new parents with meals, baby gifts, and offers to help. Marcus and Elena became unofficial grandparents, babysitting when David had to travel for follow-up legal proceedings. One evening, as Marcus watched David push his daughter in a stroller down the same sidewalk where their story had begun, he marveled at the journey they had all taken together, from suspicion to understanding, from fear to friendship, from assumptions to acceptance. The tattoo that had once been evidence in a federal conspiracy case was now covered by long sleeves as David played the role of devoted father. But Marcus knew it was still there, a permanent reminder of the courage it takes to do the right thing, even when the cost is enormous. Years later, when neighbors asked Marcus about the time when government agents searched the house down the street, he would tell them about David Park, not as a story of neighborhood suspicion and surveillance, but as a story of heroism hiding in plain sight. He learned that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who look the most ordinary, and that the most important stories are often the ones that unfold quietly in suburban neighborhoods, where the greatest adventures happen behind the facades of everyday life. And every time Marcus walked past David's house and saw the young veteran working in his garden or teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle, he was reminded that home is not just a place of safety and comfort. Sometimes, for some people, home is also a place of courage, where the heroes of democracy's most important stories raise their families, and build their futures one ordinary day at a time.